Just a short while ago, I was having a chat in the coffee shop at work with one of my colleagues, and in the middle of this conversation, he suddenly raised the Old Testament. He said, "But you know, that book of Leviticus, it talks about stoning homosexuals, doesn't it?" Oh, and started to go off. So I tried to formulate an answer, which I probably got wrong, and I'm going to find out whether I did or not, because unpacking why people are so unhappy about the Old Testament is the Dean of Sydney, Phillip Jensen.
Hello, Kel.
It was a moist moment trying to work out how you answer someone who
Yes.
really intensely dislikes the Old Testament, but he's not alone, is he?
Oh no, lots of people hate the Old Testament,
Yes.
especially people who've never read it.
Right. So why? What are the reasons for people not liking the Old Testament?
Part of it has got to do with the Old Testament is the law, and the law condemns us.
But that's not what they say. They talk about the God of the Old Testament versus the God of the New
That's
Testament,
right.
for instance.
Well, that's because when you read the whole Old Testament and you read it properly, you'll see that the God of the Old Testament is the God of both wrath and mercy. He's of justice and forgiveness. But if you don't read it, if you don't like God, if you don't like being condemned, you just pay attention to the bits that talk about the wrath and justice of God.
And you ignore the rest.
And you ignore the rest. But when they then compare it with the New Testament, it shows they haven't read the New Testament either, because they say the Old Testament, God is just and angry and vengeful. The New Testament is full of love, mercy, kindness. But in fact, the word hell only occurs in the New Testament. It occurs, I've forgotten, it's 12 out of 13 times on the lips of Jesus. And the judgment of God and the judgment of Jesus and the judgment seat of Jesus are all talked of. And vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord, in the New Testament. And the mercy and love of God is in both Old and New Testament. And it's just ignorance, really.
So people dislike it because they don't know it. But even Christians are a bit cold towards the Old Testament, aren't they?
Yes.
Long, hard book.
Yes, it takes more effort to read the Old Testament than the New Testament.
Right.
I think that's fair to say that. It's, 2-3 times longer than the New Testament, and we're in the age where we want everything quick and simple. There are long sections of it that we think, why is this here? What is this about? What is happening?
Yes. Why do we need to know about begat?
Yes, the
Yes.
genealogies, or the list of the kings of Israel, one after another, and this one comes and he lives and then he dies, and then the next one comes and lives and dies. You think, well,
What's it here for?
what's it here for?
Yes.
There are long arguments, like in the book of Job, that go on chapter after chapter, and then you find out that most of what they said was wrong.
Yes.
And you think, well, which bits am I supposed to read? Which bits am I supposed to understand?
Yes.
I remember getting a Sunday school prize once where all the bits the editors, there was a Bible, but all the bits the editors thought were unimportant was put into footnotes in very, very small font. It was a dreadful prize to give a child. Made Bible reading easy because most of the Old Testament wound up in this small font down the bottom of the page. And people don't read their Old Testaments properly, thoroughly. It's a much harder book to read. But harder book to preach on.
Well, I was going to say, it's not even just Christian folk in the pews. The preachers dodge it a fair bit, don't they?
Now, some dodge it because they have a particular theology like dispensationalism, which therefore sees the Old Testament as now irrelevant. Now, that's a big mistake. Most dodge it because it's just such hard work to preach. I preached through Jeremiah once. It's got 60-something chapters in it. And I went chapter by chapter, basically. Now, my father was a lovely, gentle, kind old man. He hardly ever criticised me. He used to say occasionally, you need a haircut, but that's about as critical as he ever got of me. But when I finished the last chapter, it took about 2 years, one on and off. So he said to me over lunch, he said, "Well, Philip, you finished Jeremiah now?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You'll never do that again, will you?"
It was not meant as an encouragement, was it?
No. And, Jeremiah, week after week, there's a lot of condemnation.
Yes.
There's a lot of the judgment that's happening on Babylon. There's a lot of Judah. There's a lot of background information, historical information, and
Well, that's
how
a
do
lot
you
of it.
preach it?
Even the narrative chapters, there's so much history to explain, to make sense of them.
That's right. And see, I can preach Colossians. It's got 4 chapters.
Yes.
When I preach Genesis, it's got 50 chapters. And so, but Colossians talks about things that are relevant directly and appreciably to my Christian life now.
Yep.
Genesis does also, but it's spread out over long tracks. And if you're going to take your Bible translation work seriously, most ministers find it hard to keep up their Hebrew.
The Greek is easy to work on.
Yeah, you get more immediate return for the effort.
Yep.
And so if I'm going to preach on a passage from, 5 or 6 chapters of Old Testament Hebrew, I'm going to spend most of the week just doing nothing but translating. So we tend to just say, I'll preach in the New Testament.
Okay. Given those are the problems, let's move on to how we can think differently about the Old Testament. And let me give you the answer that I gave the bloke in the coffee shop.
Yeah.
And then you can tell me what I got wrong.
Yeah.
When he was going on, I said, look, you've got to understand, you've got to look at the whole picture. I said, it's telling the same story as the New Testament. It's like a stage with the curtains slowly going up. And I said, what you're seeing in the early bits of the Old Testament are the feet. And then as it goes up, then you see the whole picture. If you like the whole picture in the New Testament, well, you've got to understand the curtain goes up slowly and you see gradual revelation, progressive revelation. Now, was any of that right at all?
That's good on the Old Testament.
Yes.
Which is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Won't solve his problem on homosexuality.
No. Because that's in the New Testament as well.
Yes, that's
but
what
what
saying.
I was giving him a reason
but
for
on
not
the
chucking
Old Testament,
chucking out the Old Testament.
That's
yes.
a good way of saying it. Yeah, I think it's a very helpful way of saying, because the Old Testament does provide the context for us to understand the New Testament. And context is critical in terms of meaning.
Jesus just didn't turn up. He turned up as the result of promises, preparation, prophecy.
Right. And stage is a good way of putting it, because the director and the producers, they actually create what's on the stage so that you will understand the actors when they come on board and do the deal.
Yes.
Well, God prepares the stage for Jesus to come. So the children of Israel being chosen, taken out of slavery, taken across the arrival of Moses, the giving of the law, the building of the temple, the appointment of priests and sacrifices. You need all that kind of equipment to understand Jesus when he comes as the new prophet like Moses, to do a new exodus like the exodus out of Egypt, to be the high priest who offers up the perfect sacrifice, to be the temple where we meet God. All the kind of mental vocabulary you need to understand Jesus has been given to you in the Old Testament.
So when we read the New Testament, whether we recognise it or not, it's echoing the Old Testament quite often. It's using that way of thinking.
Yes, it does more than echoing, but it does the echoing, yes, and that's really important, because context is critical to meaning. So people are saying today things about, what the Bible means to you, what the New Testament means to you is one thing, what it means to somebody else is something else, what it means to somebody, as if there is no basic truth. But there is a basic truth. It has a meaning. You may misunderstand the meaning, but just because you misunderstand the meaning doesn't mean that there is no meaning. And the meaning is set by the context.
Right.
And so if Jesus just suddenly appeared, died, went away, so what on earth that was about?
Right.
But he doesn't just suddenly appear.
It's all explained.
It's all explained and set up. So that when he arrives and dies on the cross and talks about his life as a ransom for many, and when the gospel is preached by the apostles and they talk about the great high priest, and when Jesus says that he will die and rise again, it all is fulfilment of the Old Testament categories of thought.
So what do you say in the light of that to people who say the Old Testament is the Jewish scriptures, the New Testament are the Christian scriptures?
Yes. Well, the New Testament was written by Jews. That's the first thing to understand. Jewish Christians, but Jewish Christians are true Jews. And so it was written by Jews. Luke may not have been Jewish, but if so, he's the only one who wrote a New Testament book. So it's really a Jewish book, the New Testament, but fulfilled Jews, Christian Jews. The Old Testament, though, was actually written for Christians. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and the first few verses there, it talks about what happened in the Exodus of Moses and how the people fell in the wilderness because of their sinfulness. And it says, I think it's verse 6, says, these things happened to them as examples for you and were written down for your sake, upon whom the end of the ages has come.
So the Old Testament was written for us?
Yes.
Right.
And not only was it written for us, the things that happened to them happened for us.
Right.
It happened for them as well, but it happened for them so that we would have examples to understand the ways of God. And it was written down so that we would understand the ways of God in dealing with things. So the Old Testament is the Christian book.
In fact, Jesus seemed to think it was all about himself.
Yes.
John 5, he says to the Pharisees, you think you know what Moses was writing about? He's writing about me.
Yes, that's right.
Luke 24,
Yes.
road to Emmaus.
Yes.
He says, here, from the Old Testament, I'll show you what happened to me.
That's right. And
So-
again, later in the same chapter with the disciples in the upper room, he says the same thing. He opened their minds to understand the scriptures and showed them that Christ had to, very interesting little word there, he must die and rise again, and the gospel we preach to the nations, because that's what the Old Testament said was going to happen.
If we're going to see the whole Bible as one book, 2 testaments but one book with a single picture, we should give a plug to Graham Goldsworthy, because his books are really helpful, aren't they?
Yes. Apart from the fact that he's a friend of ours.
Yes.
And
And a nice bloke.
And a nice bloke.
Yes.
Even if that were not true, Graham Goldsworthy's books are really helpful in showing you how the whole Bible holds together. They are simply written, but it's one of those simplicities that comes from deep understanding.
Yes.
You know, any fool can make it complicated, but you actually have to know what you're talking about to make it simple. And Graham knows what he's talking about.
Great Old Testament scholar.
Yep. And so, According to Plan is one of the books that they're published
Gospel and
by
Kingdom is another one.
Gospel and Kingdom. They're
Yes.
published generally by Paternoster Press and available in Christian bookshops everywhere. And they are terrific in just helping you see what Genesis has to do with Revelation,
Yes.
and how the New Testament fulfills the Old Testament, and how the Old Testament holds together.
One of the points he makes is, unless we do that, we'll misread the Old Testament.
Yes.
So we'll look at David killing
Yeah.
Goliath as being a story telling us to be courageous when facing our giants.
Yes.
And it's bigger than that. It
Yes.
fits into the gospel. So what are the principles
Well-
for reading it properly?
Firstly, you've got to understand that the Old Testament has different kinds of literature. But one kind of literature which is not very strong on is Aesop's fables.
Right.
Aesop's fables are all this, you tell the story and then you say, and the moral is.
Yes.
And there is a certain element of that. You tell the story of the Exodus and say, therefore, do not sin as they sinned. But in general, it's not like that. The book of Ecclesiastes is a terrific argument of existential life, of questioning meaning and purpose and value of life. The Psalms are a set of poems, songs that are written with a diversity of kinds, 150 different songs, with a diversity of character. Some of them are wisdom, some of them are kind of nationalistic fervour songs, some of them are deep and reflective, but a lot of them talk about the suffering of the Messiah. And then you've got what we would call history, but what the Jews in the Old Testament and the New would call the prophets and the law. So for us, law is thou shalt not, thou shalt not. But the first 5 books of the Old Testament are actually the law, which contain a whole series of events and episodes in the lives of famous people up to the time of Moses. And then there's the prophets like the kings, because what they're telling is prophetic history, not just history. They're not just describing growth in GDP. They're describing how God is sovereignly overruling in the affairs of Israel.
So how the plan is rolling out.
And how God's rolling the
Yes.
plan out. That's
Yeah.
right. And then you have the writing prophets who help you understand when the history seems to be failing, how God had bigger and better plans than you would imagine.
It's not really off track, folks. You may think that, but it's not off track.
That's right. And
Yes.
so there's warning that the great kingdom of God is going to be destroyed because there's a greater kingdom of God yet to come. And so they're preparing further for the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. So when you're reading, you've got to work out, well, what kind of literature am I reading on this occasion?
Right. So Graham Goldsworthy can give us a big framework. We need to know what literature we're reading. And there are arguments there, aren't there, that we need to see where the argument is going and where the logic is going and how it's all
Yes.
put together.
It's partly the logic and it's partly the framework.
Right.
And it's the framework. Take that one easy. Because without knowing the history of Israel, it's hard to understand where the argument and flow is going. So you do need to know a basic skeleton of the history of Israel. It's not a very big one, you know. There were Aborigines in Australia, then Captain Cook came in 1770, and then Governor Phillip came in 1788, and then Macquarie came and made it more of a town, and then went to Port Arthur, and you can trace out the history of Australia in half a dozen different
Yep.
key events. Well, the history of Israel is like that. King David was king in 1000 BC. That's a simple date to remember. Moses came before that. Moses got the people out of Egypt into Israel. Joshua got them to conquer the land. Then there were judges. Then there were the kings. You just got to trace out, well, what is the history? How did it happen?
That's the structure, the architecture.
The architecture, the framework, the structure of it. But then you need to work out the argument. Now, the argument is twofold. One, about all of humanity, and that happens in the first 11 chapters. It's about sin. It's about the rebellion of humanity against God in Adam and Eve and the judgment of God that is coming upon the world. From chapter 12 onwards, it's about how God is saving the world through a particular family, the family of Abraham.
I will bless the nations through you.
3 promises are given to Abraham, that he will become the father of a great nation, that he will own the promised land, and that through him all the nations of the world will be blessed. And those 3 promises are then worked out in his family. They're worked out in his lifetime, but they're worked out through his sons, his son Isaac, and then his grandsons Jacob and Esau and Joseph. And the story is the unfolding of that promise of God over the next nearly 2,000 years.
Now, some Christians will say, interesting to know history, but it's still history. When I read the Bible, I want to see how it applies to me.
Yes.
I've got this concern, I've got this worry, I want to grow and become more godly. Does the Old Testament do that for me? Does it apply to my life?
Yes. This is part of the reason why we shy off reading the Old Testament, because we've got to do a bit more work than with the New Testament. You have to work out, well, where does this particular verse passage fit in the grand scheme of the salvation that's in the Old Testament, so that I won't misread it by taking it out of the context of the history of Israel. That may mean in different parts of the Old Testament will apply to me differently. Some parts, like say the first 11 chapters of Genesis, are about humanity itself and have certain applications. Other parts are about the history of Israel. Other parts are about the wisdom of Israel and the wisdom of God, which is fairly, although it comes within Israel, is fairly applicable to all people under all circumstances. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, whether you're an Israelite or not. To fear Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. But that's said to Israel. And so there are parts of it. So we then have to keep thinking through, how does this apply? The key question, the easy one to start with, what has this got to do with Jesus? And therefore, what has it got to do with me? So I take everything from the Old Testament through Jesus to me. But I don't have to. There are some parts that are just directly applicable. When God says you shall not kill, he means you shall not kill. Now, Jesus helps me understand what you shall not kill means, but when he says you shall not kill, you shouldn't kill.
Yes, yeah.
Now, he says that in a particular point in time to the people of Israel. That is on Mount Sinai when he's giving the 10 Commandments and they're being established. That is a kind of a preface law to the whole contract with Israel, but it's also indicative of the character of God. So one of the problems that we faced in the Reformation was the question of the application of the Old Testament to the church today. And in our Anglican prayer book, in Articles of Faith, they say there are 3 uses of the Old Testament, namely there are the national, there's the cultic, and there's the moral. The national, there are certain laws about how the state of Israel, under the kings of Israel, should operate, which really have to do with then and there.
Yep.
Now you can
That time and place.
You can draw principles from it, and the New Testament does. So it says you shouldn't muzzle an ox when it's treading out the grain.
Yep.
Well, you can draw principles from that, such as the labourer is worthy of his hire, and so you should pay people for the work they do for you. Second one, though, but in general it's about Israel. The second one is the cultic ones, the religious ones, about priests, and temples and sacrifices. All of those ones point to Jesus, and they're all fulfilled in Jesus. And so I don't now have to build a temple and have sacrifices and appoint priests, because Jesus is the temple, the priest and the sacrifice. It's not that I don't have those laws applying to me, but I have them applying to me in the person of Jesus. The third ones, they say that there are moral ones. And Jesus says in John's Gospel, don't judge by appearances, but judge by right judgments. Another one, he says that you strain out the gnat and swallow the camel. I've got that the right way around.
Yes.
And he says you should take the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy.
And the Old Testament gives us that.
And the Old Testament gives us those big, important things. And our reformers said, well, they're the moral laws, so to speak. And they are permanently abiding because they express the character of God. God is faithful. God is just. God hates sin. And so I should be a faithful person and a just person. I should hate sin, especially in myself. That's a permanent thing, irrespective of where in the history of Israel those things were said.
So there are continuities and there are discontinuities. There are things which lead up to the New Testament and stop, and things that keep going.
That's right. And one of the problems of some churches is the applying of the Old Testament laws about the cult, about the religion, about the temple, etc., directly to the church. And that's a big mistake because you've left Jesus out.
Yes, and all the New Testament story about the temple curtain being torn is ignored.
Is ignored because, yes, the temple curtain came between mankind and God, and only the high priest could go behind that curtain, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement to confess the sins of the people and to ask for forgiveness. With the death of Jesus, that curtain is ripped apart because no longer is there the wrath of God upon sinful man as it was previously. And so we can all now come into the presence of God and ask for forgiveness. We don't need a high priest because we have a high priest in Jesus.
Basically, reading the Old Testament is just a bit more work, and we need to say to ourselves, I will do the work.
Yes, and it is valuable work because every time I read my Old Testament, I understand the New Testament better. And as I read the New Testament, I start to see more of what the Old Testament is about. And so it's a feedback system.
Well, could it be the case that sometimes bits of the Old Testament will speak to me at a time in my life when they didn't earlier? Or I'm thinking of my daughter when she was a teenager was in a youth Bible study group who got really excited about Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
Because they were going through teenage angst and the world was like that. So it helped them at that time. I mean, if we're open to the Old Testament, can things like that apply?
Well, I'm sure that happens to people, although I don't think the Bible is teaching me to use it that way.
Right.
But there are certain things going on in my life that when I read this passage, I start to see its meaning. But the meaning was there all along.
Yes.
I would rather say the more I read the New Testament, the more I understand what the Old Testament was on about.
But if I don't read the Old Testament, I'm missing out on a good thing.
Absolutely. I won't understand the New Testament either, probably.
Right.
And I'll keep misunderstanding what Jesus was doing and why he was doing it. Because I'll have the wrong categories of thought, because I won't see how he is fulfilling the Old Testament. I mean, that's the classic one we've talked of before. In Mark chapter 6, where Jesus walks on the water, gets in the boat, and they were all afraid because they didn't understand about the loaves. Now, it's a weird phrase. I think it's about Mark 6:52, something like that. It's a really weird phrase. Why was not understanding about the loaves mean that you're afraid when you see a man walk on the water and hop in the boat? I mean,
So you've taught me this before. It's all to do with Moses.
all to do with Moses.
I was paying attention.
You were, because Moses fed the multitude and Moses led the people across the sea. Jesus, and then said, someone greater than me is coming. Jesus feeds the multitudes with the loaves and then walks across the sea.
In other words, God had this in mind. Back then, God is in charge and the plan is unfolding
That's right.
in the way he says it should.
Know your Old Testament, you'll say,
Yes.
of course. But if you don't know your Old Testament, you say, gee, this is terrifying. What's happening now? I don't know what's happening.
Yes. And they didn't know their Old Testament well enough in the boat.
No.
Right.
Indeed, we're told in John's Gospel, when Jesus came into Jerusalem, he got on a colt and people cheered. And Jesus did it to fulfill Zechariah 9, But the disciples didn't understand it until after his death and resurrection and the day of Pentecost came. And then they say, oh yeah, of course he came in like Zechariah 9 said to come in. But if they'd understood their Old Testament, they would have known that Jesus arriving on a little donkey was fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9.
And if we read our New Testament well enough, it'll keep pointing us backwards anyway, won't it?
It keeps pointing back. And that's why we have in many Bibles a little column down the middle of it with cross-references. And any bit you don't understand, there's little numbers and you just go across the cross-reference and they usually take you back to somewhere in the Old Testament that is explaining it. And in your Old Testament you've got the same thing and it often takes you to the New Testament, sometimes elsewhere in the Old Testament. But cross-referencing is an important way of reading the Bible because it is 1,000 pages and it is all interconnected.
Yeah, so we need to see the connections.
Yes.
Yep.
Which means hard work reading the Bible.
Yeah. You've got some ideas now of where to start talking about the Old Testament, what it's all about, and how to study it in your home prayer and Bible study group can be a really good idea. There's an interactive Bible study published by Matthias Media, which gives you an overview of the Old, which is called Phillip what?
I don't know what it's called, but it's a great book.
Yes.
I've seen it and I've done it. Joshua wrote it,
Right.
and it's worth doing. He also did those on Hebrews.
Right.
And Hebrews is a terrific book for a group to study. It's an easier book to do in a group than it is to do by yourself in some ways. And you can't study Hebrews without constantly going back to the Old Testament.
Yeah, it will keep sending you back to, God once spoke through prophets,
Yes.
and then we'll get to all the heroes of the Old Testament and all the rest of it.
Yeah, chapter 11 gives you that long heroes of faith, but chapter 7, 8 and so on gives you about the priests and
All the temple stuff,
and
yes.
the covenant stuff. So it takes you all the time back to the Old Testament. It's a great way into the Old Testament.
So it is hard work, but it is worth doing the hard work because it really enriches studying the New Testament and the Old Testament ceases to be as closed a book. And don't forget the Graham Goldsworthy books, which will give you the framework. And if you'd like to hear more from Phillip Jensen, come along to St Andrew's Cathedral any Sunday. Phillip is here preaching and teaching and can say hello to you afterwards. So we love to see people visiting.
Always. And I like preaching for the Old Testament.
Great. Phillip Jensen, thank you for that.
Pleasure.
And thank you for your company on the chat room.